It consumed 4 tons of coal an hour just to keep the dredges running. 700,000 tons of riverbed, ripped out and turned into walls. 41,492 concrete piles driven into ground so soft it had been a swamp 18 months before. This is the story of a building constructed in 16 months that should have taken 4 years, built by men who broke laws to get the material, broke their backs to pour it, and, in at least 8 documented cases, didn't go home. It wasn't supposed to look like this. It wasn't supposed to be here at all. The men who built it were working from blueprints still wet with ink, on land that used to be a slum and a swamp in the same breath, racing a war that hadn't technically started yet. And underneath every slab of concrete in that building, every hallway, every wall, every floor, 17.5 miles of corridor, long as sand and gravel. They tore out of the Potomac River with machines running day and night, machines that didn't stop, that couldn't stop, because stopping meant the whole timetable collapsed and a general's promise to Congress turned into a lie. Look at a photo of the construction crews in late 1941. Pick any 5 men in that frame. Statistically, by the time this building was finished, one of them wouldn't be standing in another photo. None of them knew that yet. They were just trying to make the 4 o'clock pour. And here's the thing nobody tells you about the Pentagon. The single most important material in that building isn't the limestone facing, and it isn't the steel because there's almost no steel in it, and that's deliberate, and we'll get to why. The most important material is the riverbed itself, the Potomac. They didn't just build next to the river, they built the building out of the river. We don't explain that fully until the end. Hold onto it. The swamp that wouldn't hold still. The land wasn't supposed to be here either. The first site, picked for what would become the Pentagon, sat up near Arlington National Cemetery. A clean 5-sided lot, bordered by existing roads. That's actually where the 5-sided shape came from in the first place. Not some grand design philosophy, just 5 roads that happened to box in a Pentagon. But the people who cared about sightlines from the cemetery didn't want a 4-story slab of government concrete staring back at them. So, Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States, looked at a map and pointed 3/4 of a mile southeast to a stretch of ground nobody respectable wanted. They called it Hell's Bottom. It was a swamp with people living on it. A low-income neighborhood, mostly black families, packed in next to pawn shops, a pickle factory, a brickworks, an old airfield called Hoover Field that had gone obsolete. The government bought it out from under them, almost 300 acres, evictions included, and called it Progress. The land itself, even once it was empty, was the enemy. One side of the property sat 10 feet above sea level. The other side sat 40 feet up, a 22-foot difference across one building site, and underneath all of it, mud that hadn't held a heavy structure in its life. You cannot pour a 5-story building onto a swamp and expect it to stand. The ground would swallow it. So before a single wall went up, before the famous 5 rings existed even on paper in their final form, engineers had a problem that had nothing to do with architecture and everything to do with physics. How do you make unstable, waterlogged ground hold the largest office building on the planet? The answer was brutal and simple. Bury the problem under enough material that the problem stops mattering. Trucks hauled in 5.5 million cubic yards of fill dirt just to level a site that had no business being level. That's not a number that means much until you put it next to something that's enough dirt to bury a football field 300 feet deep. And once the ground was leveled, it still wasn't solid. It was just flat mud instead of uneven mud. So the next move was to drive concrete piles straight down through it until they hit something that would actually hold weight. 41,000 492 of them, eventually. Nobody had ever needed that many piles for a single building before. That was the antagonist before there was a building to defend against it. Not an enemy army, not a budget line, just ground that wouldn't hold still, on a deadline that wouldn't bend, for a war that was about to make both of those problems 100 times worse. Because here's what the engineers were racing against, and they knew it before Pearl Harbor, and they knew it twice as hard after. In July of 1941, a man named Brehon Somervell, a brigadier general, a builder by training, the kind of officer who'd already run the construction of LaGuardia Airport and 50 army camps before breakfast, called two men into his office on a Thursday. An engineer named Hugh Casey, an architect named George Bergstrom. He told them he needed a design, by Monday, for a building that could hold 40,000 workers, no more than 4 stories, no elevators if he could help it. 2 men. 1 weekend, the largest office building ever conceived. They did it. That's the part that should stop you. 2 men, sketching through a weekend, produced the bones of what would become the largest office building on Earth. And the design they handed back on Monday morning is, with adjustments, the same 5-ring, 5-sided footprint that still stands today. The site had picked the shape. The deadline had picked everything else. Before this machine of concrete and ramps and rivers existed, the alternative was the old way. The War Department staff, scattered across a patchwork of buildings around Washington, some of them temporary structures thrown up for the last war, completely unable to function as a single coordinated command in a country about to fight on 2 oceans at once. That was the impossible problem. 40,000 people who needed to work as one machine, and no building on Earth that could put them under a single roof. The Pentagon wasn't built because someone wanted a monument. It was built because the old way was already failing, and failing fast, while the world caught fire around it. So, when ground actually broke on the 11th of September, 1941, the same day, the construction contracts were finalized. No gap between paperwork and dirt. There was already a quiet, ugly truth sitting underneath the ceremony. They were building on swamp mud, on a deadline measured in months instead of years, with a design less than 2 months old, for a war that the United States had not yet officially entered. The first warning sign wasn't an accident. It was the math. Somervell promised Congress 14 months. Nobody serious thought that math worked. The old way had already proven incapable of solving the problem. This machine, this building, this 5-sided beast of poured concrete was the only other option on the table. It was either this, or watching the war effort run on borrowed office space until it broke. They'd bought the land. They'd leveled the swamp. They'd drawn the plans in a weekend that should have taken a year. Now came the part that would actually kill people, making this thing physically exist, on schedule, out of materials the country could barely spare. 500,000 tons of river poured into walls. By the time crews were 3 months into construction, the war that had only been a rumor on the blueprints became real. Pearl Harbor happened on the 7th of December, 1941, less than 3 months after groundbreaking. And every assumption about how fast this building needed to exist got thrown out the window. President Roosevelt moved control of the whole project from the Quartermaster Corps to the Army Corps of Engineers on December, first days before the attack. As if the war had already started in every way that mattered except the official declaration, 4,000 men were working 3 shifts by then. That number would more than triple before the building was done. Here's the chain reaction that built this thing, and it starts somewhere you wouldn't expect. Not in a steel mill, but in the riverbed. The country was at war, which meant steel was rationed like blood. In a transfusion ward, every ton of it earmarked for ships, for tanks, for guns. A normal office building this size would have needed a steel skeleton holding it up. The Pentagon couldn't have one. So the engineers made a decision that, on paper, sounds like a compromise, and in practice was a kind of brilliant, desperate workaround. They would build almost the entire structure out of reinforced concrete instead. Reinforced concrete cut the steel requirement by more than half. That single decision is why the building looks the way it does: squat, horizontal, more bunker than monument. It wasn't an aesthetic choice. It was a war-rationing trick, baked into the architecture itself. But concrete needs sand and gravel and water, and you need it in quantities that don't exist in any normal supply chain. The answer was right there, flowing past the construction site, the Potomac River. Engineers brought in dredges, massive suction and cutter machines that chew into a riverbed and pull up sediment by the ton and set them running against the bottom of the Potomac, day and night, hauling up sand and gravel that would go straight into the concrete mixers. Estimates range from roughly 400,000 to 700,000 tons of riverbed material dredged and dumped into batch plants that never stopped running. 435,000 cubic yards of concrete. Eventually, almost all of it made from a river they'd half-emptied to do it. Think about what that machine actually was. Mechanically, a dredge doesn't gently scoop, it tears. A cutter head spins at the business end of a long boom, grinding into the riverbed, while a suction pipe behind it vacuums up the slurry of sand, mud, and water, and pumps it through a floating pipeline straight to the batch plant on shore. The same suction force that could clear that much riverbed in months could just as easily pull a man under if he got too close to the intake, or catch a limb in the cutterhead's gearing if maintenance went wrong mid-shift. The power that built the building and the power that could kill the man operating it were the exact same number on the exact same gauge. And once that slurry hit the batch plant, it became a different kind of danger. A concrete batch plant in full operation is a controlled chain of violence aggregate, crashing down through hoppers, cement powder fed by auger screws under pressure, water and admixture dumped in at exact timed intervals, the whole mixture churning in a rotating drum that has to keep moving or the load sets up like stone right where it sits. Get caught in a jammed feed chute, and the same machine that's pouring out 400,000 cubic yards of liquid stone can crush a hand in the time it takes to look away. The men running these plants work them in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. Because the moment the plant stopped, the poor schedule for an entire wedge of the building stopped with it. And Somerville's 14-month promise to Congress got a little more impossible. So how did they make sure the dredges and the plants never ran dry? This is where the project stopped being just an engineering problem and started edging into something closer to wartime improvisation that bent the normal rules of commerce. Barges loaded with sand and gravel were already moving up the Potomac, headed to their normal civilian customers, private buyers, regular contracts, regular business. Army officers from the Pentagon project met those barges on the water and requisitioned them on the spot. Mid-transit. Material that belonged, by contract, to someone else. Redirected at the river by men with military authority and a deadline that didn't care about anyone's paperwork but their own. That's not theft, technically. It's wartime priority. But stand in the shoes of the civilian buyer who never got his gravel and tell me the difference matters to him. This is the context nobody puts on the postcard. The Pentagon wasn't just built fast. It was built by an operation that, when it needed something, simply took it. River sediment torn out by force, barges seized mid-delivery, an entire neighborhood evicted to clear the footprint. The building's elegance, The symmetry of those 5 rings sits on top of a supply chain that ran on commandeered material and overruled civilians. But could the dredges actually keep pace with what the batch plants needed? That was the question, hanging over the whole operation in the first months. A single cutter suction dredge, working a riverbed at full capacity, could move thousands of cubic yards of sediment in a day. But the Potomac wasn't an infinite quarry. Pull too hard from one stretch of riverbed and you'd hit bedrock, or worse, destabilize the channel itself, undercutting the very ground the project needed to stay solid. So engineers staged the dredging in sweeps, working different sections of the river on a rotation, never draining one stretch completely before moving downstream and circling back. It worked. It also meant there was no slack in the supply chain at all. If one dredge went down for repairs, the batch plants on shore had hours, not days, before they ran dry. And go dry they nearly did. More than once. Equipment built for sustained operation in the 1940s wasn't built for sustained operation at this scale. Cutter heads dulled against unexpected rock. Suction pipes clogged with debris nobody had charted, because nobody had ever needed to chart the bottom of this stretch of river before. Every breakdown meant a maintenance crew working out over the water, in the dark sometimes, trying to clear a jam on a machine that was never designed to be serviced under deadline pressure this severe. That's where the dangerous manual intervention came in, not glamorous, not the kind of moment that makes the history books, just a man with a wrench standing where the suction force could pull him in if his footing went. And the specs that made this possible were the same specs that made it lethal. A concrete pile driver doesn't gently set a 41,000-pound concrete piling into soft ground. It drops a hammer, sometimes a literal free-falling weight, sometimes a steam or diesel-powered ram from height, again and again, onto the head of the pile, driving it down through swamp mud by brute repeated force until it hits something solid enough to bear weight. 41,492 times that hammer fell. Every single drop carried enough force to drive concrete through mud, and every single drop, mistimed by a fraction of a second, carried enough force to kill a man standing in the wrong place when it came down. The machine that gave this building its foundation and the machine that could end a life were the same machine, doing the same motion at the same speed. Could the schedule survive a single miscalculation? Nobody wanted to find out. So the rigs ran constantly, crews rotating through 3 shifts, hammers dropping around the clock on a site that, 18 months earlier, had been a swamp where nothing heavier than a duck could stand. But the ground problem and the steel problem weren't the only context of impossibility here. There was a third one, quieter, baked into the budget itself. Somerville, worried that Congress would balk at the true scale of what he was building, told lawmakers the Pentagon would be roughly 4 million square feet. The actual final figure came in past 6 million, partly because, midway through construction, the decision was made to add an entire 5th floor that hadn't been in the original pitch to Congress. That's not an engineering challenge. That's a political one. And it's a trick as real as anything done with concrete or steel. Undersell the size. Build it bigger anyway. Let the cost overrun surface only after the foundation's already poured, and there's no version of events where Congress unfunds a half-finished War Department headquarters in the middle of a war. The gearing of this whole operation, the dredges, the batch plants, the pile rigs, the budget math was brilliant. It solved an impossible set of constraints in record time. But brilliant systems built this fast, this lean, on this little margin for error, have a way of finding their weak point eventually. And the weak point on this job wasn't going to be the concrete. It was going to be the men standing next to the machines that poured it, the 3-shift machine that never slept. The bridge from blueprint to building ran through the bodies of the men who poured it, and by the summer of 1942, that workforce had swollen past 13,000 people, working in 3 rotating shifts. That meant this site never went dark, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Somewhere on that footprint, at 3 in the morning, men were pouring concrete by floodlight, while 100 yards away, a different crew was just clocking in for the day shift, and a third crew was somewhere asleep, trying to recover enough to do it again in 8 hours. What was that actually like? Standing inside it. Picture standing in a forest of cranes and tower hoists. That's the literal phrase used to describe the site. In early 1942, a forest, meaning there were so many lifting machines clustered together that the skyline of the construction site looked mechanical instead of natural. Carpenters worked in assembly lines, building wooden forms for columns and beams and walls at a pace closer to a factory than a traditional job site, because traditional pacing wasn't fast enough. 6,000 workers were placing concrete slabs and hanging limestone facing simultaneously in different wedges of the building, at different stages, because the entire project was designed to run 5 sections at once, each one staged just ahead of the next. So material delivery and skilled labor never had to wait for anything. That sounds efficient on paper. On the ground, it meant there was no slow season, no easy week, no stretch where the pressure let up enough for a man to catch his breath. The schedule had no slack built into it, because slack was the one thing Somervell had promised Congress they wouldn't need. And underneath the noise and the floodlights and the forest of cranes, there was a fault line running straight through the workforce that had nothing to do with concrete at all. Virginia in 1941 still enforced racial segregation by law, and the Pentagon, built on land that had been a black neighborhood before the government emptied it out, opened with separate bathrooms and separate dining halls for black and white workers. Men who'd been evicted from Hell's Bottom to make room for this building were now working construction on top of where their homes used to stand, and doing it under a segregation policy enforced by the same government that took the land. It didn't last. Black workers protested hard immediately, and within the first month of the policy being enforced, it collapsed. Segregation at the Pentagon's construction site ended faster than almost anywhere else in wartime Virginia. Not because the Army suddenly developed a conscience, but because the men doing the work refused to accept it and made that refusal impossible to ignore on a job site that couldn't afford a single day of disrupted labor. That's worth sitting with. The same urgency that requisitioned barges off the river and bent budget numbers to Congress also, eventually, bent to the workers who built the place, but only because they forced it to. That tension didn't disappear once the bathrooms were desegregated. It just went underground, the way exhaustion does. Picture the worst job on that site, not the cranes, not the dredges, but the men working the forms at height, hanging limestone slabs, or guiding piles into position in the leads of a driving rig, while a multi-ton hammer waited above their heads for the signal to drop. There was no margin in that work for a tired hand or a half-second of distraction. A man standing in the wrong spot when a pile shifted or a hoist line went slack at the wrong moment wasn't protected by anything except his own attention and the discipline of the crew around him. 3 shifts a day, every day, for 16 months, is a long time to ask a man's attention to be perfect. What broke down first on a job like this? It wasn't usually the big machines, the dredges, the cranes. The pile rigs were built tough and maintained hard because nobody could afford downtime. It was the human systems around them. A man who'd been awake 19 hours because his relief didn't show. A signal missed between a crane operator 40 feet up and a rigger on the ground because the noise of a forest of machinery running at once swallowed shouted warnings whole. A foreman pushing a crew to finish one more pour before the shift change because the schedule had no room for tomorrow. Remember the river we mentioned at the start, the one this whole building was secretly made of? Most of the men hauling its sediment up out of the water and into the batch plants had no idea they were part of the central trick of the whole project. They just knew the sand was wet, heavy, and never stopped coming. The full weight of what that material actually was wouldn't matter to history until the building stood there, finished, looking nothing like a riverbed at all. There was no time, either, to build in the kind of redundancy that might have caught a problem before it became a body count. Safety inspections on a job moving this fast meant a man walking a site that was actively changing underneath him. A wedge that was solid ground yesterday might be an open trench today. A scaffold that passed inspection at dawn might be carrying triple the intended load by the afternoon shift because the schedule called for it. Nobody had the luxury of stopping the clock to check. Those are the close calls nobody wrote down. There's no surviving ledger of every near miss on the Pentagon construction site, no list of every load that swung wrong and missed someone by inches. Every hammer drop that came a half-second early and didn't connect. What we do have is the part of the record that couldn't be hidden. 8 men did not survive this project. 8 confirmed deaths. On a job where, by the project's own later acknowledgement, safety practices were sometimes lax, because the pace of recruitment and the pace of construction outran the pace of caution. For months, the machine ran like this 3 shifts. Around the clock, a forest of cranes against the sky, dredges chewing the riverbed, a workforce racing a war. And then, somewhere in that relentless rhythm, the math that had been working in the project's favor for over a year started running the other direction. 8 men, 16 months, no margin. There is no single, cinematic account of the worst day at the Pentagon construction site. No headline that survives intact, naming the man, the hour, the exact machine that failed. That's not because nothing happened. It's because the record itself is a casualty of the same urgency that built the place. Paperwork that didn't directly speed up the next pour wasn't a priority in 1942. Safety incident reports, individual case files on construction deaths, those things existed somewhere, in a system that was moving too fast and too lean to preserve them the way a modern project would. What we know for certain is the number. 8 workers died during the construction of the Pentagon. We're not going to invent the details the record doesn't give us, because that would be its own kind of dishonesty. The same dishonesty Somervell used when he told Congress this building was 4 million square feet instead of 6. But we can tell you with confidence what kind of danger those 8 men were almost certainly facing, because the machines on that site are documented in exhaustive, brutal detail elsewhere. On projects just like it, in the exact same era, doing the exact same work. Pile-driving accidents from this period and from decades after follow a pattern that repeats with grim consistency. A hammer drops before a worker has cleared the lead. A pile being hoisted into position slips its rigging and falls. A man guiding a beam into a trench gets caught between the pile and the wall when the hammer strikes off-center instead of true. These aren't exotic failures. They're the single most common way a man dies around a pile-driving rig. And the Pentagon site ran 41,492 of those drives around the clock for the better part of a year. If you want to know what likely killed some of the 8 men whose names didn't survive in an easy-to-find record, start there at the leads of a pile rig, in the half-second between a signal given and a hammer falling, with a tired man standing somewhere he shouldn't have been. Crane and hoist failures follow their own pattern from this era. A load swings unexpectedly under a forest of simultaneous lifting operations where signals get crossed and visibility is never as good as it needs to be. Concrete batch plant accidents follow theirs. A man caught in a feed mechanism, an auger, a chute, doing the kind of dangerous manual intervention that keeps a machine running when stopping it isn't an option the schedule allows. Could they have prevented it? Almost certainly, with more time and more inspectors and a schedule that allowed for caution instead of treating it as a luxury. But that's the kind of question that only gets asked after the fact, by people who weren't standing on the site in 1942 watching a war get closer by the week. At the time, the question being asked wasn't, "Is this safe enough?" It was, "Will this be finished in time?" Those two questions rarely point in the same direction on a project moving this fast. And on the Pentagon site, the second question always won. This is the honest gap in the story, and it deserves to be named plainly instead of papered over. We don't have the individual stories of the 8 men the Pentagon's construction killed. What we have, instead, is a documented parallel from the same era, the same kind of project, the same impossible deadlines. The Hoover Dam, built less than a decade earlier under comparably brutal wartime-style urgency, where the official death toll was deliberately undercounted for years, where men died of pneumonia that was really carbon monoxide poisoning in the diversion tunnels, where the company controlling the records had every incentive to make the human cost look smaller than it was. The Pentagon's 8 deaths are the official number. The pattern from Hoover Dam, and from nearly every other megaproject run on this kind of schedule, suggests official numbers from this era tend to be floors, not ceilings. And the public reaction to those deaths, at the time, largely silence. There was a war on. A construction worker dying on a War Department job site in 1942 wasn't competing for headline space with troop movements in the Pacific and casualty lists from actual combat. The same urgency that built this building in 16 months instead of 4 years also meant the men who died building it never got the kind of public reckoning that, in a slower era, they might have. There's no dramatic congressional investigation to point to here. No sweeping safety reform that followed directly from the Pentagon's death toll the way later disasters would force OSHA regulations decades down the road. The project's answer to danger wasn't to slow down. It was to keep moving. Because the war that justified building this thing in the first place was the same war that made stopping for grief feel like a luxury nobody on that site believed they had. That's the breaking point here, and it's a quieter one than you might expect from a story this big. There's no single catastrophic collapse, no headline disaster that shut the project down for inspection. The breaking point is the steady accumulation of risk that the entire machine simply absorbed and kept running through 8 men, swallowed one at a time, across 16 months, on a job that never once considered stopping the clock to mourn them properly, because Somervell had told Congress 14 months and every day lost to anything, including death, was a day closer to that promise becoming a lie. The building got finished anyway. The dead were buried, quietly, without the building ever pausing to notice. The machine kept running, and in January of 1943, it was done. What the river became. The Pentagon opened on the 15th of January, 1943, 16 months after groundbreaking. A building that some early estimates said would take 4 years, finished in barely a third of that time. By then it had absorbed 13,000 workers at its peak, 435,000 cubic yards of concrete, 41,492 piles, and somewhere between 4 and 700,000 tons of riverbed sediment dredged out of the Potomac and poured into walls that are still standing today. It did exactly what it was built to do. It pulled the War Department's scattered, inefficient command structure staff spread across temporary buildings all over Washington into a single, coordinated machine, just in time for the United States to fight a war on two oceans simultaneously. Whatever the human cost of building it, the building itself functioned. It became the operational heart of the largest military the country had ever assembled, and it remained that for the rest of the war and every conflict since. Think about what that actually meant, in practical terms, for the people running the war from inside it. Before the Pentagon, getting a decision made across the Army, Navy, and War Department meant physically driving between buildings scattered across a city, losing hours just moving paper and people from one address to another. After the Pentagon, that same decision could move from one office to another inside a single structure in under 10 minutes, no matter how far apart those offices sat on the 5 rings. That's not a small thing in a war being fought on a clock. The building that nearly killed 8 men in its construction went on to save uncountable hours, every single day, for the institution running America's half of a world war. What remains of the original 1,942 construction today? More than you'd think. The 5 concentric rings, the 5-sided shape born from 5 accidental roads on a site they ultimately didn't even use, the reinforced concrete poured from a half-emptied riverbed, all of it is still the skeleton of the building people see today. The original ramps are still there, still functioning, a permanent monument to a wartime steel shortage that most visitors walking those slopes have never heard of. For nearly 70 years, the only elevators in the building were the original 13, built strictly for freight, because passenger elevators would have eaten steel the country couldn't spare. People who couldn't manage the ramps simply didn't have another option. For decades, because of a material shortage from 1941. What replaced the urgency that built it? Eventually, peacetime did. The frantic 3-shift, 24-hour pace ended the moment the building was finished. Because the war that justified it was still raging, but the building, at least, was done. The dredges stopped. The pile rigs moved to the next job. The forest of cranes thinned out and disappeared. What had been the most dangerous, most relentless construction site in the country quietly became an office building, full of desks and filing cabinets and the ordinary administrative grind of running a war from a building that had nearly killed 8 of the people who built it. Here's the thing we promised to come back to: the named hook from the very beginning. The single most important material in the Pentagon was never the limestone on the outside, and it was never the small amount of steel buried in the reinforcement. It was the riverbed. The Potomac itself, torn apart by dredges, running around the clock, pumped through pipelines, mixed in batch plants that ran men past exhaustion, and poured into the shape of the largest office building human beings have ever constructed. Every hallway, every wall, every one of those 17.5 miles of corridor used to be the bottom of a river. The building didn't just get built near the Potomac. In the most literal sense possible, it was built out of it. And that's the reframe worth sitting with. We look at the Pentagon today and we see a fortress, 5-sided, symmetrical, the architectural shorthand for American military power itself. What we don't see, standing in those corridors, is the swamp that used to be underneath it, the neighborhood that got evicted to clear the lot, the barges seized mid-river to keep the batch plants fed, the segregation policy that lasted less than a month because the workers refused to accept it, and the 8 men whose names didn't make it into the official histories the way Somerville's promise to Congress did. Progress, on this job, didn't ask permission. It commandeered barges. It bent budget numbers. It ran 3 shifts through a swamp for 16 straight months and called the result a triumph of American engineering, which it was, and which, at the exact same time, it never stopped being something else. A building made out of a river, raised on the backs of men who weren't given the luxury of slowing down, even when slowing down might have meant going home that night. Walk those corridors today, and nothing about them whispers any of this. No plaque mentions the 8 men. No marker shows where Hell's Bottom used to stand, or where the riverbed used to be before it became a wall. The building simply works the way it was built to work, silent about everything it cost to make it that way. They don't build them like that anymore. Not the deadline, not the desperation, and not, thank God, the silence that followed the 8 men this building cost before it ever held a single desk.